Hello, this is the last in a series of videos on the concept of benefit in the thought of the Damascene jurist Ibn Taymiyya. The topic of this video is wise purpose in God's acts. Ibn Taymiyya differed sharply on this issue with the Ash'ari theologians of his day. The question here is, does God himself act to attain benefits? Ash'ari theologians said no. God's acts are not caused by purposes or motives. God does not act to attain benefits, and God did not give the law for human benefit. According to the Ash'aris, if God acted for a cause or purpose, God would change, and God would be subject to time. And then we would get an infinite regress of temporal causes and purposes in God. Purposes in God's will would make God dependent on those purposes for his perfection. Despite all this, Ash'aris still discerned that there was benefit in the law. The rulings of the law did happen to coincide with human benefit. So it followed that it was most probably to our advantage to follow the law, even if God did not himself will to benefit us in the law. To Ibn Taymiyya, this is pure contradiction. It is a contradiction to say that the law provides benefit, but God had no wise purpose in revealing it. Ibn Taymiyya insists that God's action is consistent with the character of the law. God acts for causes and wise purposes, and God's wise purposes include benefiting humankind through the law. Ibn Taymiyya also rejects the Ash'ari arguments against cause and purpose in God's acts. And he has no problem with temporality in the essence of God, although he prefers to speak instead of God's voluntary attributes and God's voluntary acts. For him, a God who is active is more perfect than a God who is timelessly eternal. Ibn Taymiyya also has no problem with an infinite regress of wise purposes in God. He maintains that God creates one thing or another from eternity without beginning. God in his perfection has been acting, speaking, and creating from eternity by his will and power according to his wise purposes. God's perpetual creativity means that there has always been one created thing or another. No one thing in the world is eternal, but there has always been one world or another. Ibn Taymiyya's theology of God's perpetual activity allows him to think of God's actions as guided by concern for benefit. Ibn Taymiyya rejects the God of Ash'ari theology as aimless and blameworthy. Instead, according to Ibn Taymiyya, God acts for wise purposes that revert back to God himself and benefit humankind too. Ibn Taymiyya writes, "Anyone who commits an act in which there is neither pleasure, nor benefit, nor profit for himself in any respect, neither sooner nor later, is aimless, and he is not praised for this. The only acts that are rational are those that involve some kind of benefit and profit redounding to the agent of the act, and not just to the recipient of the act." This leads Ibn Taymiyya to say that God always does what is the finest and the best. For example, God sends messengers to bring as much benefit as possible. Ibn Taymiyya writes, "The messengers were raised up to obtain benefits and perfect them, and to strip away detriments and reduce them to the extent possible." Similar logic applies to things like rain. Rain is certainly profitable overall, even if it sometimes destroys homes and disrupts travelers. In short, God in his wise purpose maximizes benefit in all that he does, and God always creates the best possible world. So why didn't God create the world perfect at the beginning? Ibn Taymiyya says that the perfection of the world involves some evil. God creates evil for wise purposes. These wise purposes are not always apparent, but Ibn Taymiyya does give us clues about what they are. Evil, for example, nurtures patience. It punishes and purifies. It leads people to repentance. God's wise purpose in evil is ultimately to lead everyone to love and worship God alone. Even hellfire plays a role. Ibn Taymiyya concluded late in his life that there is no wise purpose in chastising anyone in hellfire forever. Moreover, prophetic tradition said that God's mercy will overcome God's wrath. The implication is that hellfire will end and everyone will be saved. Ibn Taymiyya is consistent in following his theology of God's wise purpose through to its logical end. Final and full benefit is found in all creation, worshiping God alone. This brings us to the end of the series on benefit in the thought of Ibn Taymiyya. Thank you for joining me.